This is Revealing Russia, a series of programs in which the Voice of Russia explores the nation's history, culture and relations with the West. My name is Brendan Cole. Our guest and guide in these travels is the longtime student of Russia, the historian Orlando Figes. This series was inspired by his seminal history of Russian culture, the book Natashas Dance.
Like all of Russia's greatest poets, Akhmatova felt the moral obligation to be the voice of memory. But her sense of duty transcended the national. She felt a Christian imperative to remain in Russia and to suffer with the people in their destiny. As did many poets of her generation, she considered the revolution as punishment for sin and believed it was her calling to atone for Russia's transgressions through the prayer of poetry.
You write about the poet Akhmatova, and she was dismissed as a figure from the past, as you say in your book. To what extent was she an example of the impact that this new burgeoning Soviet Union had on artists, on writers?
A very good example, I think, and her work was virtually unpublishable in the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s. And I suppose at the heart of this is a clash between the universal values of art and the particular needs of the regime from the artist. You know, her husband, the art critic Nikolai Punin, responded to a bitter attack on Akhmatova's work, claiming, well, you know, she's incompatible with the Soviet order. What would happen if she put on a leather jacket and wore a red star? Would that make her work any more acceptable? What would you do with Johann Sebastian Bach if he did the same? You know, so what is needed from the artist? And I suppose in the case of the Russian or Soviet artist, it's her Russianness which is the problem, because Bach can be allowed. The fact that Akhmatova had a husband who'd fought with the monarchists in the Civil War, the fact that she represented for the Soviet order something from the past made her Russianness a problem in the Soviet context. So it's her personality, it's her nationality, it's her political identity which they find a problem with. And that's the case with so many artists, that a regime unable to identify what it is in their art that is necessarily subversive, latch on to what is subversive symbolically in their biographies. So the artist in the Soviet Union, in a sense, becomes a victim of the general trend of repression in the Soviet Union, which is you're not allowed to have what they called a spoilt biography. You are not allowed to have anything in your past which is incompatible with the new political order.
And she was also connected to Nikolai Gumilev. She was married to him.
She was, yes.
And he was shot by the Bolsheviks,
he was shot,
wasn't he? But he wasn't the last great writer to be killed. I mean, this must have had a tremendous impact on Soviet artists and the stories and the art that they were creating.
It does. It lends to poetry, I think, in particular, a tremendous urgency. I mean, Mandelstam, who was also to be repressed under Stalin, said that, you know, poetry mattered more than anywhere else in the world in Russia because, you know, poets were shot for their work. And that, I think, gives the artist, in the Soviet period, a sort of hypertrophied or exaggerated significance, which is building on the Russian tradition of the artist under the Tsars, to speak for the people, to be a sort of moral voice, an ethical guide, to provide a canon of works with which the people can identify, to speak for them and give their ideals and hopes expression in a way that politicians and parliaments can't. But which, you know, in the Soviet period becomes much more complicated because of that urgency, the fact that, you know, for the first time artists really are being shot for their works. And it gives it a greater urgency and significance because, in a sense, the Aesopian language of the writer becomes more important. This sort of subliminal or indirect communication of art, the reading between the lines that has to take place, this becomes much more significant. So however much the Soviet regime may have tried to suppress Akhmatova, you know, her works were known. In the Second World War, Great Patriotic War, you know, soldiers still knew her works and recited her works, went into battle with little bits of her poetry written on bits of paper kept inside pockets. So poetry is sort of maybe forced underground, but lives in the collective memory as part of a culture in that sense, in a way that the regime's unable to suppress.
And Akhmatova really aligned herself more further on in her career with Pushkin's work, who himself had been censored by the Tsar a century before that. So there was a common denominator in that there was a defiance of authority. Would that be fair to say?
Perhaps. I mean, from the mid-1920s, when she can't get published, she turns a lot of her attention to scholarship on Pushkin's works, his folklore and so on. And I think perhaps, yes, she does identify with this Russian tradition. I mean, she's described as an internal exile along with Tsvetaeva. And in a sense, that is what she is. She's an internal exile of Russia living in the Soviet Union. And so from underneath this sort of overlay of Soviet ideology, she is perhaps identifying with the universalism of Russian culture, which Pushkin represents. You know, the writer and great intellectual Isaiah Berlin, who visited Akhmatova very famously in 1945, asked her on that visit, did she see the Renaissance as a real historical period or as something imagined and fantastic? And she said, of course, the latter, because to connect with the tradition of the Renaissance, within which I think she would put Pushkin, is an expression of nostalgia. And in a sense, that is what she feels, I think, and what so many artists feel who reconnect to the Russian tradition from within their Soviet exile. They're expressing some element of nostalgia for Russia's part in a much more universal or European culture, from which politically, from 1917, it becomes isolated.
In terms of exile, I mean, there were significant artists of global renown from Russia, Stravinsky, Gorky, Nureyev, Nabokov, I suppose. I mean, to what extent did exile play a role in these works, and how did it influence them?
That's a very tortuous question, especially for the writers. I mean, for Gorky, who spoke no foreign languages, who could only write in Russian, could only be read in Russian, to be in exile, however wonderful it might be to live in Sorrento, is a nightmare, because his only readers there are Russian white émigrés who despise him for political reasons. In a sense, he's lost his raison d'être as a writer. Nabokov, very different, because he speaks many languages and he can write, and writes wonderfully in English. So he becomes an English language writer. So for the writer, it's a particular problem. For the artist, it's perhaps easier, as it is perhaps for the great composers of the emigration, Prokofiev and Stravinsky or Rachmaninoff. It depends on the art form, I think. But I think regardless of that, in all of these cases, what you see is a sort of great ambivalence about their physical being in exile, as opposed to their sense of belonging in Russia, whatever its politics. So you see that in Gorky, you know, in agony, in a sense, in exile in Italy, wants to come back to the Soviet Union, does, but it's a disaster for him. Likewise for Prokofiev, you know, in emigration, in New York, in Paris, is in agony, partly because he's overshadowed by Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky, but also because he feels the need to be in Russia for his music to find full expression. When he returns, not at a great time in 1936, he's in agony there because politically he can't survive. And for Stravinsky, yeah, slightly different relationship. But I think, you know, throughout his life, although forced into emigration from well before the revolution of 1917, when he finally returns on a 3-week visit in 1962, this emotional outburst is very clear in Stravinsky, because he's suddenly recognizing all those elements of his Russianness, which have been sort of put into storage perhaps, but nonetheless have influenced him.
I did not leave Russia of my own will, even though I disliked much in my Russia and in Russia generally. Yet the right to criticize Russia is mine, because Russia is mine, and because I love it, and I do not give any foreigner that right.
Now, Stravinsky, Rachmaninoff, these are global names. But in terms of how the West see them, the West see these great artists as only artists in exile, I suppose. So for them, would it be fair to say that a Western notion of Russian artists was Russians who had to leave the country to create?
Yes, perhaps in the 20th century, the artistic work of Russian émigrés was better known in the West and was perhaps appreciated, therefore, as a sort of exoticism. There's no doubt that part of the appeal of Rachmaninoff, part of the appeal of Stravinsky was that they were emblems of an exotic Russianness. In some ways, it's a funny irony, isn't it? We, as Westerners, expect Russian music to sound Russian. It's not enough for it to be just good music. It has to somehow have all of these recognizable motifs, harmonies, rhythms that we associate with the Russian nationalist tradition of the 19th century and folk music and the Belarus and all the rest of it.
For Nabokov, Russia was contained in his dreams of childhood summers on the family estate, mushroom hunting, the sound of creaking snow. For Stravinsky, it was the sounds of Petersburg, which he also recalled from his boyhood. For the exiled poet Marina Tsvetaeva, like most émigrés, she was torn between two notions of her native land. The first was the Russia that remains inside yourself. This interior Russia was a country that was not confined to any territory. One can live outside Russia and have it in your heart.
So perhaps the exile of these great figures crystallized that and set it in a way that it was then difficult for artists in emigration to break out of. And perhaps the inverse of that is that as a result of the domination of those great figures, the West doesn't know as well figures of Soviet literature which weren't exported, which perhaps were much more popular within the Soviet Union, so that as a result, what Russians understand by Russian culture is a rather different lineage, rather different sort of pantheon of writers and artists compared to what Westerners know of Russian culture.
What about, say, some of those writers and composers? I mean, what kind of Russia were they representing to the West in exile?
Those who were in exile, I would say, just as Akhmatova feels this nostalgia for a universal culture and her own internal emigration from it, living in the Soviet Union. So I would say that many of those exiled figures, Rachmaninoff in particular, and certainly Bunin, have a nostalgia for the Russia that they imagine, largely a pre-revolutionary Russia, of course, and invoke it in many of their works. So that separation from the language, from the people, from the smell of the earth, from the place that they remember from their childhood, all of these associations which are so important for an artist become sort of intensified through the experience of exile. And then, of course, that is how, as I said, Western audiences then appreciate the Russianness of Russian culture. And I think that then does become a problem for Russia, that it's sort of unable to escape this sort of box it's been put into as sort of the Russian exotic box.
But they're not political figures, do you think? I mean, they're not trying to throw brickbats from outside of Russia towards what was happening in the Soviet Union at that time.
No, but they've become political pawns, if I can adopt a different metaphor. I mean, clearly, if one thinks about the Nobel Prize controversy, Gorky versus Bunin, that was something that in the 1930s was very much part of the West's conflict with the Soviet Union, and likewise Pasternak's award of the Nobel Prize after Dr. Zhivago and the Soviet government's intimidation of him to the point where he wasn't really allowed to go abroad to accept it. That was, again, very much part of the Cold War and a Soviet policy. There have been moments when artists have become political pawns in a way that's quite unfortunate. But then, of course, there have been moments when artists, both from emigration and from within the Soviet Union, I think have acted as important cultural and in a way political bridgeheads between the West and the Soviet Union. I mean, I referred to it before. I mean, Stravinsky's return at the height of the Khrushchev thaw in 1962 was one such sort of cultural bridgehead, and did lead to a greater appreciation in the West, I think, of Soviet culture. I think Stravinsky opened the door for a greater appreciation in the West of Shostakovich's music, for example.
You write about the proletarian culture movement, the prolet cult, and you describe how it really wanted to create new forms of social life. Do you mean that it was trying to create a kind of cultural revolution to match the actual revolution? And to what extent is there a Soviet culture?
What a great question. Yeah, I suppose prolet cult, born, as you say, of the Civil War period and this attempt to build a cultural revolution to define a culture which is going to be distinctively Soviet, it stumbles precisely on that problem. What is a Soviet culture going to be? There was a hope in the early utopian years that they could build something completely new and educate a new generation of Soviet proletarian writers who were going to express their proletarian vision in a way that would allow the revolution to cut all links with the civilization of the past. And it, soon became obvious. I mean, Gorky spotted it, and Gorky was going to be, I suppose, the great champion of prolet cult as the first sort of proletarian writer. But as soon as he returns to the Soviet Union, even on his first visits back from 1928 onwards, he sees prolet cult's a complete disaster because they can't produce from the factory floor writers of any distinction. And as many in the Soviet regime itself would have said all along, you need to preserve the greatness of Russian culture. You need to build on a base that has been already laid for the system by Tolstoy, by Pushkin, by all the artists and composers of the 19th century. That is something that is positive. That is a civilization which simply has to be put to the use of the masses. In a sense, in a way that the populists and socialists and indeed Democrats of the 19th century thought they could use culture to educate the peasants, to raise the level of civilization of the ordinary people. And in a sense, that becomes the project of the 1930s, doesn't it? That becomes the real cultural revolution, which is the one pushed through by Stalin, where the Soviet population in that generation, which for the first time becomes literate on a mass level, the generation put through Soviet schools in the 1920s and 1930s, what are they reading? They're reading the classics. And in the 1930s, they're churning out the classics in their millions. So in a sense, already by the early 30s, prolet cult well and truly dead. The regime is recognizing there is probably no such thing as Soviet culture. There is simply an ideological overlay on top of Russian culture. And that Russian nationalism is also quite a useful thing for the regime to deploy as a base for mobilization at a time when, if you think about it, collectivization, the 5-year plans, there's so much social turmoil taking place, people being uprooted in such huge numbers, so much uncertainty and dislocation that to grab onto something familiar, like, the classics of Russian literature, is a very useful political ploy as well.
So an interesting vindication of what had gone before, effectively, prior to the revolution, that the Russian greats. And interesting that you made the point that Akhmatova, her poetry was read during the Second World War by soldiers known as the Great Patriotic War to Russians. And I don't know if the story is apocryphal or not, but copies of War and Peace being read also on the front line. So there really was, in terms of one of the most significant events for Russian history, the Great Patriotic War, they're taking their cultural cues and their inspiration very much from the past, aren't they?
Certainly in the Great Patriotic War they are, yes. And I think that's a recognition by Stalin, no less, that the Russian people, the Soviet people, aren't really going to fight for the party. They're not going to fight for the revolution even, but they will fight for the motherland. And so, all the symbols of Russia's greatness, the generals of the 18th century, the saints of medieval times, the church is rehabilitated and given a new lease of life in return for its moral support. Russian national symbols are deployed and used on medals as they're given out in their millions. And all of this is the appeal of patriotism. And culturally too, yes, there are many link backs to this Russian tradition of the 19th century, but I think that was already happening. We can see it very clearly in the Pushkin centenary celebrations of 1937, and we can see it before that in the nationalism of the Stalinist regime churning out the classics in their millions. And we can certainly see it after the war, when I would go so far as to say that great Russian nationalism replaces internationalism altogether as the sort of foundation ideology of the Soviet system. We see in that sort of post-war Zhdanovshchina period a great sort of chauvinistic Russian nationalism being asserted as part of Soviet pride and identity, at the expense even of the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. So Russian nationalism becomes important, and the Sovietization, and I use that word deliberately, Sovietization of the Russian cultural tradition is a very important part of that. When I say Sovietization, I mean to imply that it is a distortion of the Russian cultural tradition, because whereas the 19th century classics were a great humanist democratic tradition by and large, in Soviet hands, they get turned into socialist realism, effectively. And socialist realism is a political ideology to project on the basis of a realistic portrayal of some sort of idealized version of the present into the revolutionary future being built by communism. That is not something that that is already a propaganda tool, using the canon of works, turning it to political purposes. Clearly, it also has another element, which is that it does, and this is to the great credit of the Soviet system, I suppose, it does give the vast majority of the population their first access to literature. It does create the most literate society in the world by the end of the Soviet period. Whether that would have been possible by the more utopian literary experiments being churned out in the 1920s or not, I don't know.
And I suppose that mass readership that was instigated under the Soviet system, I suppose in terms of the Cold War, that possibly wasn't really appreciated in the West, just how well educated Russians were and how kind of patriotic they felt after the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in the Cold War image of the Soviet Union, this was a very dark and grey place where people were brainwashed. I think the level of education was not appreciated. I mean, I think what everyone says about the Soviet Union politically, it did have this fantastic record of science and technology and of a literate level of the population, as I say, unparalleled in the world, really. I'd also say that actually within the Soviet school system and within the culture generally, there was not only this emphasis on science and technology and rather rigorous methods that were abandoned in the West pedagogically long before, but it also had this emphasis on high culture. So at a time when the West was turning to sort of rock and roll and everything was dumbing down, perhaps, in the Soviet Union there was still this emphasis on reading the classics and on going to concerts of classical music and so on. It had its positive sides. It also had its negative sides, of course, because a lot of people, once they had come across rock and roll, jazz, the films of Tarzan or whatever else it was, they found the sort of rather conformist Soviet culture at the time rather boring.
It didn't stop great artists like Tarkovsky from making films that were globally recognized as being masterpieces. So to what extent was he a Soviet filmmaker? Was he a Russian filmmaker? And was he projecting something about Russia towards the West?
Oh, very much so, yes. I mean, I think Tarkovsky, was he Russian or Soviet? Well, he was clearly both. I think that, he was also an artist in exile for the latter part of his life. But he was definitely doing something with science fiction, with his films, like Stalker. He was doing something which I think was really very Russian and very much part of that Russian tradition of the artist asking big moral, ethical, even religious questions, mystical questions.
In Andrei Tarkovsky's masterpiece, Solaris, the exploration of outer space becomes a moral and spiritual quest for self-knowledge, love, and faith.
So if you compare, say, Solaris with Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, which are both ostensibly at roughly the same time, Kubrick's film is about the cosmos viewed from Earth, looking outwards, and it's about the material technological progress involved in that, I suppose. Whereas Solaris is about, it uses space exploration actually to reflect back on the world. And it's a religious discourse in many ways. Chris, the main character of it, clearly, missing a T, but otherwise his identification with the Christ story, the sacrifice involved in Solaris, the finding of spiritual salvation, which is at the end of Chris's journey. That is, something very Russian, I think, in that tradition of the artist, of the writer, and in Tarkovsky's case, the filmmaker, using his trade, his craft to explore big ideas and to search for something spiritual. And that's perhaps a Russian preoccupation, and it does go back to this idea of the Russian soul, the idea, mythical however much it may be, that whatever scientific, technological progress and superiority the West may have over Russia, the Russians have this mystical, soul-searching yearning which makes them spiritually and morally higher.
For the past 200 years, the arts in Russia have served as an arena for political, philosophical, and religious debate in the absence of a parliament or a free press. As Tolstoy wrote in A Few Words on War and Peace, the great artistic prose works of the Russian tradition were not novels in the European sense. They were huge poetic structures for symbolic contemplation, not unlike icons, laboratories in which to test ideas, and, like a science or religion, they were animated by the search for truth. The overarching subject of all these works was Russia, its character, its history, its customs and conventions, its spiritual essence, and its destiny.
That was the third and final program of our series Revealing Russia, in which the historian Orlando Figes explains Russia's history, culture and relationship with the West. This has been brought to you by the Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole.
Сердце жалобно забьется с востока, ворогом чувств не для меня. Твое сердце жалобно забьется с востока, ворогом чувств не для меня.
You are not allowed to have anything in your past which is incompatible with the new political order.
And she was also connected to Nikolai Gumilev. She was married to him.
She was, yes.
And he was shot by the Bolsheviks.
He was shot.
Wasn't he? But he wasn't the last great writer to be killed. I mean, this must have had a tremendous impact on Soviet artists and the stories and the art that they were creating.
It does. It lends to poetry, I think in particular, a tremendous urgency. I mean, Mandelstam, who was also to be repressed under Stalin, said that, poetry mattered more than anywhere else in the world in Russia because, poets were shot for their work. And that, I think, gives the artist, in the Soviet period, a sort of hypertrophied or exaggerated significance which is building on the Russian tradition of the artist under the Tsars to speak for the people, to be a sort of moral voice, an ethical guide, to provide a canon of works with which the people can identify, to speak for them and give their ideals and hopes expression in a way that politicians and parliaments can't. But which, in the Soviet period becomes much more complicated because of that urgency, the fact that, for the first time, artists really are being shot for their works. And it gives it a greater urgency and significance because, in a sense, the Aesopian language of the writer becomes more important. This sort of subliminal or indirect communication of art, the reading between the lines that has to take place, this becomes much more significant. So however much the Soviet regime may have tried to suppress Akhmatova, her works were known. In the Second World War, Great Patriotic War, soldiers still knew her works and recited her works, went into battle with
poets of her generation. She considered the revolution as punishment for sin and believed it was her calling to atone for Russia's transgressions through the prayer of poetry.
You write about the poet Akhmatova, and she was dismissed as a figure from the past, as you say in your book. To what extent was she an example of the impact that this new burgeoning Soviet Union had on artists, on writers?
A very good example, I think, and her work was virtually unpublishable in the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s. And I suppose at the heart of this is a clash between the universal values of art and the particular needs of the regime from the artist. Her husband, the art critic Nikolai Punin, responded to a bitter attack on Akhmatova's work, claiming, well, she's incompatible with the Soviet order. What would happen if she put on a leather jacket and wore a red star? Would that make her work any more acceptable? What would you do with Johann Sebastian Bach if he did the same? So what is needed from the artist? And I suppose in the case of the Russian or Soviet artist, it's her Russianness which is the problem, because Bach can be allowed. The fact that Akhmatova had a husband who'd fought with the monarchists in the Civil War, the fact that she represented for the Soviet order something from the past, made her Russianness a problem in the Soviet context. So it's her personality, it's her nationality, it's her political identity which they find a problem with. And that's the case with so many artists, that a regime unable to identify what it is in their art that is necessarily subversive, latch on to what is subversive symbolically in their biographies. So the artist in the Soviet Union, in a sense, becomes a victim of the general trend of repression in the Soviet Union, which is you're not allowed to have what they called a spoilt biography.
This is Revealing Russia, a series of programs in which the Voice of Russia explores the nation's history, culture, and relations with the West. My name is Brendan Cole. Our guest and guide in these travels is the longtime student of Russia, the historian Orlando Figes. This series was inspired by his seminal history of Russian culture, the book Natashas Dance.
Like all of Russia's greatest poets, Akhmatova felt the moral obligation to be the voice of memory. But her sense of duty transcended the national. She felt a Christian imperative to remain in Russia and to suffer with the people in their destiny, as did many